Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, February 21st, 2023. Those of you that might be new to this format, this is a question and answer where we invite family, friends of current Evoke clients and past Evoke clients to attend and ask their questions. You can always send in questions, even if you're not an Evoke participant. You can always send in questions, comments, suggestions to webinar@evoketherapy.com. So we compiled a list of questions. It sounds like we have quite a few this evening that we're gonna get to. So you're welcome to send in questions at any time. I'll get to as many as I can. Whatever I don't get to will be left over until the next time. So let's start with our first question, our first pre-submitted question. Somebody writes, what are some of the best ways to emulate the therapeutic benefits of wilderness at home? Before we started this, Sarah showed me that question. I usually don't see the questions in advance, and when she put that down there, I thought to myself, that's a big question because there's so many benefits. There's so many aspects of wilderness therapy that are beneficial, and what should I focus on? So much of it is therapy, right? There's communication skills training, there's listening, there's boundaries, there's all the kinds of things that you would hear from anybody talking about healthy parent education or family education. But I think really what I thought was what came to me was a couple of things. The nature of wilderness therapy as an intervention itself without the therapy on top of it, just the wilderness part of it is I think it can teach us something that we can emulate at home. I wrote something in my first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, where I described something I called a grocery store lecture, where I took at the time my now 30-year-old son. At the time I wrote the book, he was a teenager, and I asked him I had a conversation with him about something that we needed to talk about while we were grocery shopping together. And I made it really light. I didn't sit down knee to knee, stare at him, and say, I need to have a talk. But I had a talk with him while we were walking down the grocery store aisle. And in between, I asked him to go grab some milk or go grab something for me very intentionally to take the intensity down just a little bit. I didn't want to present a threat to my son. I didn't want to have that response, that look that many of our children give us, where their eyes glass over and they just give us that 1,000-yard stare while we're talking to them. So I think what wellness therapy can teach us that we can emulate at home is that it's in the context of living where most of the lessons are taught. It's not the lectures. It's not definitely. It's not us giving our best speech, but it's short. It's in between. It's side by side. It's looking out at a lake, looking out at a mountain range, walking together, but not necessarily what we might consider confronting the defense. And that most of the important lessons are taught in between what we think are the big lessons. The boundaries do the teaching for us. One of the things that I can be seduced by as a parent and as a therapist is really good academic intellectual conversations. I love really deep thought provoking conversations. And if somebody's willing to share complex insights and epiphanies that they're having in therapy, I can be sucked into that as I can put an overemphasis on that. But really the most important things that are taught in the boundaries that we keep. I remember one time, and I've told this story generically in the past, but I remember one time when I was hiking with the kids while I was doing one of my sessions in my latter years of doing wilderness therapy. I didn't hike with the kids because I needed to focus and I wanted to go over reading and writing assignments. But back then we were hiking together. And because we were hiking, we ended up being the last pair, the last of the group hiking along this trail. So everybody had passed the spot that we were now walking through. And I saw a bunch of garbage on the ground that we didn't create, that our group didn't create. But one of our ethics out there is always to leave the wilderness better than we found it. So we have an ethic to pick up trash. In fact, we have a trash bag that we carry on hikes that we'll put trash into as we go. And I remember pausing at the trash, small little trash on the ground, and calling the entire group back, which took a minute or so for everybody to turn around to figure out what I was trying to ask for and to walk back up. We all circled around, formed a circle like we often do when we have group discussions. We of course not accidentally circle around the garbage that was sitting on the trail. And I just asked the person, I said, who has the garbage sack for the day for the hike? and somebody raised their hand. I said, "Would you make sure to pick that up?" And they looked at me kind of funny, and they leaned down and they picked it up, and I said, "That's all. We can keep going." And while that might be a little bit of a production more than, in fact, it kind of goes against the point that I'm making, it's in the little things. I think sometimes because of our adult brains, we think that children change from the inside out. We think that people change from the inside out. I think more than they really do. But really, in a lot of ways, people change from the outside in. It is the environment, right, that changes us. That's why picking our environments is so crucial, so important. That's why in 12-step work they say you have to change your playground and your playmates, because environment has a huge impact on us. That's what so much of therapy is about, is saying, tell me what happened to you. Tell me what you experienced in the world. But really, I think a lot of times we think that we're going to talk our children into something, lecture them into something, and I think that's a misstep on our part. So the boundaries, the life lessons come in the context of daily living. That's the first thought that came to my mind. So it's more of an embracing of this idea that less is more, less confrontation, less direct teaching is more. I've said this before and I stand by today. I really do very little teaching with my children. Very little. I do as little as I can with my children. But that's not to say that my children don't learn values and principles and ideas from us, because it happens in the normal conversation, the normal context of discussing things and interacting at the dinner table. So I think it's the journey. The journey is the lesson. The journey is the teacher. I think so many times we try to contrive lessons and teach them to our children, but it's only with experience in life that they realize that it's not our ideas that we're trying to teach, but it's really how the world works, right? There's an old idea that your child learns more and more and more the farther they get away from the house, because they're confronted with the world, with nature. So that's the first thing, is that the journey is the teacher, and that we don't have to be as formal as we think. In fact, at times I think the messages are lost when they're formal. And I think the second thing that's again, it's deeper than just wilderness therapy, is that the detours are not the detours. The triggers are not the triggers. The detours are the path. And like I've written and spoken about lately, the trigger is not in the way, the trigger is the way. Because what happens in the wilderness is there's so much out there that's outside of your control. The weather, your 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 crazy peers, the crazy staff, the crazy therapists, right? Everybody's got their own ideas and their own agenda. And so anytime you try to control things, you bump up against nature, you bump up against other people, and you have to learn. You either fight that and resist that, and develop symptoms and become passive aggressive, or aggressive or passive, or you learn how to compromise, you learn how to communicate. So I think the second thing to emulate is to embrace the setbacks, the failures, the sidetracks, the detours, the triggers. And in the wilderness, it happens magically. It happens so clearly out there that when I went out there to visit my son when he was in the wilderness, I remember wanting to control the weather. I had been a wilderness therapist for over 10 years at that point. But when I went out there as a father, I wanted the weather to be perfect. I was frustrated with the rain. I was frustrated with anything that wasn't perfect psychotherapy conditions. And I remember specifically, I can still see it. I could still hear it, because it was loud rain and wind that was affecting our shelter. I remember thinking, this is the lesson. This is the therapy, being in life. So the first one is to embrace the journey and know that the journey is the teacher. And the second one kind of is kind of the more advanced version of that, which is, and I spend a lot of my times talking with clients, teaching people in parent education or couples education, that what we think of as the things that are setbacks and detours are really part of the lesson. They're trying to teach us something. Life, the universe, God, whatever it is, however you conceptualize it, life is teaching us the things that we need to learn, the things that are pertinent to our journey. So I think embracing those things would be for me, the things that come out of wilderness therapy, to embrace failure, to embrace difficulty, to embrace trigger. When I say the trigger is not in the way, the trigger is the way. What I'm saying is when you get triggered, there's your work. There's something there. There's something that's being prodded or poked inside of you that you're sensitive to, some reaction that you're having that with some focus and exploration, you can uncover the wound, the trauma response that you're having, the reactive response that you're having, and you can start to heal and make sense of it and become more intentional. So for me, those are the things that are most important. And especially I think about working with adolescents in outpatient therapy, which I don't do very often anymore. But when I have worked with adolescents in outpatient therapy, I think a lot of people could do better to play games, to discuss things that the child is interested in instead of psychotherapy or workbooks on psychotherapy, to take a walk, to discuss current events, sports, whatever it is, art, whatever it is that interests the child. And through that medium, right? Through that path, connection, safety, communication, relationship, insight can be built upon that. So that's what I would say. Thanks for the question. It's a great one. Somebody writes, our son is currently in wilderness on week 5. When we are together with our son again, what are some of the appropriate actions if he lies to us? That's a great question. And if you haven't seen the broadcast or listened to the broadcast on transitions, I would encourage you to do that. Overall, and it goes back to the previous question that I was just answering. What I think we can do as parents is to realize that there's a longer arc to this process than we think. When I was a younger parent, I was the hammer to every nail. I thought having a formal education in family therapy and family systems theory and family relationships, having a doctoral degree in it, I thought that I was going to be able to control and prevent and basically shape and mold my children up into what I thought would be good people, good citizens. But that energy of trying to control and manage it was part of the problem, right? I had just I'd acquired education, but my own anxiety, my own urgency was too great of a burden for the child to bear. It was basically just anxiety. So what I would say is find places to slow it down. If you've been the hammer, if you've been in denial, if you've been ignoring it, if you've been passive and avoidant, maybe there's some different coaching. But in a lot of ways, remember that part of our teaching is going to take a lifetime, right? The rest of our life to our children. And losing battles to win the war is really, really important. And our sense of urgency as parents, right? The belief that if we don't fix this issue or address this issue, our child is never going to make it in the world. If this characteristic or this trait or this dishonesty isn't addressed and fixed, where can our child possibly end up in this world? That's a trauma response. That's a fear-based response. That lends itself to control. So I would slow down. I wouldn't take every opportunity. When I'm doing therapy with somebody in the wilderness, with a child in the wilderness, and I'm sitting there for an hour and 20 minutes, let's say, I don't point out every point. And there are several things that I know a child is trying to impress me with, right? Trying to please me, either because of shame and guilt. They want to look good, or because they know to some degree I hold the keys to their departure because I'm giving updates and recommendations to the parents. But a lot of times I wait for one or two things. I prioritize the most important things. I was a guest on somebody's podcast this morning, and I was telling this story about my good friend Peter, who passed away last year. And I said to Peter years ago, I knew he had been in therapy, And I during one of our visits, I said, "Hey, how's therapy going?" And he said, "Oh, I stopped going. It's a waste of money." I said, Why is that? Why do you say that?" And he said, "Well, I just realized I was going and I was lying to my therapist every week. I was trying to impress them. I was trying to look good." And I had a belly laugh in response. And I said to him, "Peter, I said, Peter, everybody does that. That's the that's the presenting issue, the problem. And it takes time to let down your guard." I've been in with my current therapist for 24 years now, and I can still find myself at times wanting to impress her, wanting to show her how shiny and bright and wise and healed and good I am. And sometimes when I notice that, I try to have compassion, right? I try to say, "That's this history that you have, Brad, where you were led to believe, where you came to the conclusion that your lovability was measured by how good you were, and whatever else you want to put under that larger umbrella of good. And the great risk is when you can talk about your horrible, rotten self, when you can, in essence, confess." Right? I love that idea of therapy being a kind of confession. And when the therapist reacts to something that you think is bad or horrible, and they react to it as if it's nothing, no big deal, healing occurs in that moment. Self forgiveness occurs in that moment. Trauma is mitigated, reduced. Our hypervigilance is quieted a little bit. So I would slow down. I often say to parents, you don't have to decide things based on everything your child says. And sometimes knowing that they're not telling you the entire truth, not acting on every every lie, every every untruth, but paying attention maybe to why they're lying, what they're afraid of, always going to what's underneath the behaviors, what's driving the behaviors. And I know parents often think, well, they're just trying to avoid accountability. They're trying to avoid getting in trouble, having consequences. Yes, that plays into it for sure. But that only speaks to this need to be softer and slower more. Folks, in many ways, your children are going to be okay if we can all just get out of their way. I mean, Willer's therapy is a legitimate intervention, but part of it is just giving them an experience with themselves. And in psychotherapy, I think about it often in terms of getting out of the client's way. When I talk about being a good enough therapist or a good enough parent, that's a real term in the literature, being a good enough parent. It's just not to do too much harm. So hold boundaries, make your decisions based on what you know, what you believe, but give the child some dignity. They're overmatched by your power and control in their life. That's a real thing. You have a tremendous amount of power. You have a tremendous amount of decision-making power that they don't have. And so we can approach them with a compassion. We can understand what they're afraid of. We can understand and remind ourselves how difficult it is. We can still keep boundaries, but we don't have to become the hammer to every nail. And over time, my experience with my children, I would say very clearly that the two children who have been the most oppositional, my oldest and my youngest, I have two in between, but the ones that were more demonstrative with their acting out behaviors, very clearly in both cases. My youngest is now 15, my oldest is now 30. Very clearly, there was a significant shift when I slowed down, when I stopped playing cops and robbers with them. When I not only did I focus on what was more important, but I prioritized. I thought I'm not going to get 10 messages across. I might just get one across or two if I'm really, really lucky. And growing up, maturing, getting your entire brain. I mean, we talk about it like it's just a side idea, but they literally don't have the part of their brain that thinks through things rationally, that makes decisions, that's able to anticipate, that manages the executive functioning. Some of them don't ever have some of those capacities because of they're neurologically diverse. That's true of some people, of course. But for our children under the age of about 25, they're missing the part of their brain that makes them an adult. So try to dial down the intensity. If you find yourself being reactive or wanting to point out everything, that's a trauma response. That's a fear response that you have to manage it, you have to control it, and you have to control it now. And that energy is harmful in the relationship. The child ends up feeling like an object instead of a person. Great question. Thank you. Next question reads, I have a 19-year-old son who has been reclusive and non-social for around 3 years now. I really wanted him to go to wilderness therapy, but it's so difficult to get a kid to leave for another state who doesn't even leave the house. Should I let go of hope of him going if he stays resistant? I don't know if you should let go of hope. That's a personal decision. I suppose what I would say right now is, and I don't know you, make sure that you're doing your work. Make sure that you're, if you haven't tried Codependence Anonymous or Al-Anon or Families Anonymous, make sure you understand where you stop and they start. Make sure you're spending time with a therapist that can offer you parenting therapy or parenting coaching, parenting education. So again, you're tuning into the behavior. In essence, folks, similar to the last question that I just answered, don't try to solve the behavioral problem. In the previous question, it was lying, and in this question, it's being reclusive. Try to find and make contact with the underlying dilemma, the underlying feeling. Try to resonate with that. It was just this week, in the last 7 days, we were having a discussion around the dinner table, my wife, myself, and our 15-year-old, and I was connecting. I was connecting to what she was feeling, and she was feeling some anger, some depression, some frustration, some what my people might describe as negative feelings. And I was in a good spot. I was able to connect, and we were finishing each other's sentences. And my wife and I were talking later about a specific behavioral infraction of hers, not important right now. And I was saying, because we talk about this stuff between us very, very intentionally. And I was saying, when I was connecting to her, I was trying to address the behavioral infraction. I wasn't talking about the behavioral infraction. I wasn't addressing it, but I was trying to give her a place where she felt seen and heard and understood. And it wasn't a technique, it was a skill I was using, but it was genuine from the heart. She was stating a lot of things that I felt as a child, as a teenager, and nobody was there to listen or understand or relate to me. And so when the behavioral infraction came up as it did that evening, that next morning, actually, it was something that happened that evening. I said, "That's what it is. It's true. I'm going to live what I teach and not focus on behavior. I'm not going to focus on school or truancy, grades or truancy. I'm going to focus on her mental health. I'm going to double and triple down on that." I even said to her, I've told this story on this broadcast. I told her sometime last year, I said, "You don't have to graduate from high school if you don't want to." And I've given the background, like I'm the biggest proponent of education. I have an advanced degree, my wife has an advanced degree, my 2 older children have advanced degrees. My 3rd child is getting their bachelor's degree right now at their first choice college. I'm a big proponent of education, but I could feel the power struggle. I could feel that we were focusing on behaviors. It's the same thing with working with eating disorders. If you focus on the numbers on the scale and the food, you're not addressing the psychological issue. See, the symptoms, this is the magic. The symptoms, the goal of a symptom, a mental health symptom, mental illness symptom, is to mask the authentic dilemma, the authentic suffering, as Carl Jung puts it. Neuroses, he said, is an excuse or cover up for legitimate suffering, is what Carl Jung says. And so not only does it mask the authentic suffering that's underneath, but it distracts everybody else too. If you can get somebody to talk about numbers on a scale, then you don't have to talk about feelings of self-worth, about why the person's trying to physically embody this idea of perfection that is obviously skewed and off a great deal. Why they're rebelling against eating, for example. I'm just using eating disorders as the thing. So hold your boundaries. Get clear about your boundaries. That's what happens in parenting therapy. That's what happens in parent coaching. That's what happens in Al-Anon and Codependence Anonymous. Get clear about your boundaries. Set better boundaries, not more boundaries, but better boundaries for the right things. Work on that. Understand what that is. But put the greatest amount of your energy into understanding what's beneath the behaviors, the why. Why are they doing this? How is this? Remember, think about it this way. If a mental illness symptom, a mental health symptom, is in some ways, it's a solution. So, for example, if lying is a solution, or if being reclusive is a solution, then what's the problem? What problem is that symptom trying to solve? And again, it's not one discussion, it's not one question, it's a way of being. Another thing with both of these questions, with the lying and the reclusiveness, none of this turns itself over in a conversation or in a day or in a weekend. It's learning to be in a different kind of relationship with our children, with ourselves, really, first and foremost, and then with our children. And over time, change occurs. But again, I think we get so excited, anxious to make quick changes because we project out into the future where this is going if it doesn't change. And that kind of fear-based thinking doesn't lend itself to creativity, to insight, to our best thinking. So it takes time. The biggest barrier, I've said this recently, the biggest barrier to anybody making progress in their mental health journey is the pace. And those of you that are listening, if you're a mom or a dad, a parent, even if you're not, remember that this stuff takes our entire life. And hopefully we don't arrive. Because if you arrive, you're dead in a manner of speaking. Then there's nothing else to learn, and you've foreclosed on your life, on your journey. So the pace is slow, but walking in the direction of mental health and awareness, of enlightenment, is enough. Is enough joy. Somebody writes, so I do know at a deep level that my job and my work is currently my work is centered around knowing myself, my values, my truth, my vision. To know myself, that tiny child in there who was so scared and figured out how to hide very well has to begin to emerge. That emerging is very difficult too. That child is so hidden away that not much of her is available to me, even when I work very hard in therapy and to take care of myself. Most of my big T trauma was from my babyhood and very young childhood, and I have done an incredible job forgetting. I have a sense that if I could somehow remember details of that trauma, I would know my inner child, hence myself, so much more easily, which would accelerate my healing greatly. Do you have any recommendations for people in this type of situation? Really, really, really great question. I can tell that you're making your best effort to work. And again, I don't look at these questions in advance. I see them just as I'm reading them to you. Um, my first answer, my first response to your question is you're doing it. It doesn't come usually for most of us in a great epiphany, a rapturous moment of awareness. It comes little by little, step by step. And I hope you have a therapist that can communicate that to you. I hope you have a therapist who regularly reminds you that they themselves are every bit as flawed as you are. Every bit is struggle as much as you do at a fundamental level, right? We're all the same in that way. Um, you'll remember when you're ready to remember. And there's actually more. See, this is what I learned. What I've learned, I said on the podcast where I was a guest today that um, they asked me to introduce myself, my background, and what I said was, well, I'm a therapy client. First and foremost, what I bring to the table in this work is I'm a client, a long-term client who also happens to have a PhD in marriage and family therapy. So I'm able to articulate the process, but I'm really, most of what I offer to you all is my work. So with that in mind, I'll tell you my work. It's not like I remember new things about my childhood. I, I just know what I'm up against today. I know the fights that my wife and I have. I know that the arguments, the power struggles, the difficulties that I have with my children, with my clients for that matter, with my employees. Right? I know what comes up for me, and I can trace them back. The way I've said it before is my therapist used to say things about my mother and father. I was mostly raised by my mother, so she would often refer to my mother, but she would say things about her. I would tell her a story, and my therapist would say, "Well, that was because your mother was," and then she would describe her, and I would think, "I haven't I haven't told you enough about my mother for you to know that. I can't really trust what you're saying." And I thought she was taking a pretty large leap or even a guess. And today I look back on everything and it's obvious to me. I remember my publisher asked me in my first meeting with her, she said, "How long does it take you to understand somebody and the background?" And I said, "If I'm paying attention and really tuning in, it's pretty quick. People start to tell me about their childhood, even when they're not talking about their childhood." You know, if I were extending that logic to your question, I think this might be a good example. It would be that you have an expectation that you have to get it right, that you have to be good, and that you have to get it right sooner rather than later. I'm taking a leap. Again, that might not sound like it fits, but you're like most of us. That's why I just gave the answer around pace, the slowness of the pace being the biggest barrier to psychotherapy. My answer to you is keep going. Just keep going. You're on the right path. And now today, it's not like I have retrieved memories from my childhood that were lost and forgotten. It's that I see my childhood with different eyes. I remember it with a different brain. I see it through a different filter. And so what I'm suggesting is that there's more right in front of you that you can't yet see. And the more work you do, it will come into focus. Not because you'll remember an event or a memory that you didn't have. It's just, I'll give you one last example in answer to this question. My wife, she was having a conversation with her father a few years ago. Her father, in his last year or two of life, became immobile. He couldn't travel because of health concerns. And he was talking to her on the phone, and he was asking her um, to stand in his place and to go to a funeral, and maybe even to speak at the funeral of his sister that he could not attend because he was immobile. And I only heard the half of the conversation where my wife was talking. I didn't hear his until she shared with me her version of it afterwards. And I heard my wife saying, "Okay," and then she finally said, "Dad, I'm not sure that I want to do that." I'm not sure I felt comfortable. I don't even know if I can attend the funeral. I wasn't very close to my aunt, to your sister. I got a lot of stuff going on right now with the kids, with what's going on in our life. I don't know if I can get away, and I don't feel comfortable speaking at the funeral with somebody that I wasn't very close to. So I'm not very comfortable with that. And her dad struggled with that. She told me later, but she was very calm, and she ended up ending the conversation at some point. And she just said to me very, very nonchalant, she said, years ago, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, that conversation would have gone very different. I would have been defensive. I would have felt guilty. I would have maybe told my dad that I would try to do it, or we would have gotten into an argument. I mean, my wife is in her 50s, right? And she said, but now I was able to see very clearly his anxiety, his inclination to control me, his guilting of me, and I was able to kind of let it fall to the ground, not take it on, not carry it. And we've talked about this with both of our parents, both of our upbringings. That's not a new process for her father. But the way my mother talks to me isn't fundamentally different than the way that she was treating me when I was 8 years old. The raw primal aspects of her personality are still in place. So she's not become more unhealthy. She's not become worse at boundaries. She's not become more emotionally manipulative or guilting. I just couldn't see it. So now my wife and I, we look back on our childhoods with the new awareness of what is health, what is appropriate, what's a boundary, what's healthy listening, what's assertive communication, all the things, right? We look at the world through those lenses, and we see things we didn't see before. Not because there's a new memory, but because we have a new perspective on the exact same memory. So in my opinion, folks, psychotherapy isn't always, it's wonderful if you have this great recovered memory, right? This wonderful thing that laid hidden. And I've had some of those too, for sure. But more often than not, it's a subtle process that is still so very sublime. When I walk through a grocery store today, when I sit in a restaurant and I listen to a father, I told this story a few years ago, a father talking to what looked like his 12-year-old daughter. I hear things that I wouldn't have heard 10 years ago because of what I've learned. So keep going. You're on the right path. You might remember things that you've forgotten, but more likely you'll see things that you remember still in a much, much different way. And you'll understand the legacy of the small T. You talked about big tree. You talked about big T trauma being in your babyhood. And that makes sense. But most of the stuff that we struggle with is small T. Really? The big T stuff in a lot of ways only lasts to the extent that we weren't able to process it. In other words, the big T stuff gets compounded by the small T stuff. But if you had a safe container, if you had healthy parents, right? Capable parents who were willing to find resources, even if they didn't have money, to find resources, if they were able to listen and talk about difficult things. Like Fred Rogers said, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. Fred Rogers did a great job with little kids on TV, letting them talk about their feelings. The small T stuff is the stuff, guys. The big T stuff, we typically have very little control over, unless we're the creator of it. But the big T stuff, it's not going to ruin us if there's good support. Like I've shared many times, my dissertation looked at big T trauma and tried to assess whether anything in the family system could mitigate that big T trauma, could lessen it, could dampen the effect. And we found very clearly that there was just one thing above all else, and that was the presence of a capable, consistent, empathic adult in the child's life. And then the big T traumas, there was no difference between the people that experienced the big T traumas and those that didn't if they had that person in their life. So I hope that helps. Somebody writes, my sibling is very harsh with their child, particularly with regards to academics. The child attends a very academically challenging private school and is having trouble keeping up with the curriculum. I see how hurt the child is by their parents' routine yelling and anger over the child's trouble at school, and I'm worried for the child's long-term mental health and sense of self-worth. Some of this reminds me of my relationship with my child, who ended up in residential treatment. My child is doing much better now, and I've learned so much that it has made me a better parent to all of my children. I accept them and love them as they are, and I'm no longer as codependent on them for my own well-being. Well said. I want to share some of what I've learned with my sibling, but I'm not sure how to broach it or whether it's appropriate to intervene. It's heartbreaking to watch their child suffer when I know that it could be a lot different. Do you have any advice? Great question. And again, your question is a evidence of your work, your deep work, your consistent work. The first principle is to strike while the iron is cold. I think that's one of the most important things I've learned in talking to my wife and family. Strike while the iron is cold, not in an upregulated space. But the second thing is be ready to drop it if it goes south. In psychotherapy, when I train therapists, I tell them the big mistakes aren't the first thing that is offered by a therapist. To offer an interpretation or an idea or a feedback, an observation, you can get that wrong no matter who you are. It can be ill-timed or off target. That can happen to anybody, does happen to everybody. The problem is when we double down. The problem is when we become attached to it, when we can't drop it. So I would hold your thought, your offer lightly. Make sure that it comes, of course, from a place of love. But if your sibling says, screw this, or who do you think you are, or, that's off, you're off the mark or whatever, drop it quickly. If you hold on to it, if you try to re-explain it, if you try to teach them how they're missing the point, or that they're being defensive, or that they're not seeing it comes from a place of love or caring, or that you yourself have learned this lesson too, right? You're doubling down. That's when it goes south. That's when the relationship is ruptured. And in parenting and in psychotherapy, I teach to hold our opinions very, very lightly and be willing to fail, meaning be willing to drop it. And that is by far the most consistent mistake I see psychotherapists make in therapy, is that when a client resists an offering, an idea, something, that the therapist goes over it again and again and again. Same with parenting. Same with, in this case, being a sibling. You might not get through. They might not be ready. Even if it's the right time, the right mood, the iron is cold, and you offer it with the most skills, they might be too threatened by it. And then you've just found their defense. And if you don't drop it, it's only going to get worse. And if you do drop it, if you drop it effortlessly and don't go into a defended place yourself, right? Don't take your ball and go home. They'll trust you a little bit more. They would be more apt to come around a second time and ask about it, or to pause and to listen and ask a follow-up question. Dropping it, folks, holding it lightly is really important. There's no value. I see parents and therapists talk about this all the time. I hear therapists say with pride, I used to say this with pride, I'm not afraid to say the hard thing. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. That's ridiculous. That's gratuitous. That's self-congratulatory as a therapist. Our whole job is dealing with defenses. And defenses are merely protections that people get put up to protect them from a threat. That's all it is. Nothing more, nothing less. That's why once we can lower the defense by being a safe person, the information is easy to communicate, easily received. All we're dealing with is shame and defenses. And that's why enlightened folks are not better than us. They've just made peace with their horrible, rotten self. They've just made peace with who they are. They're not at war with the world and the way that it is. And once you accept your fallible, human, horrible, rotten, imperfect self, it's pretty easy after that. So if you are going too fast, if something you say is a threat to the other person and you haven't done your work and you take their defense and their counter move, if you take it personally, then you're in your defense. So you have to be willing to let it go effortlessly, without ego, without effort almost. Thank you. Somebody writes, loved the podcast regarding doing hard things. I appreciated you discussing the Knight in Rusty Armor further too. I have so many books on my want to read list. I completely and vividly see how all this pertains to my kids. I did remove the obstacles because I had resentment from my mom for making me endure them. I then removed as much as I could. My daughters are now older, busy in college, school, and unwilling to do the hard stuff. I completely see how this willingness is an effective tool for all of this, but they would never. What is another way? I am guessing you would say therapy and time. There has to be another. Any thoughts? Yes, I would say therapy and time. You've been listening, you've been reading. You know how you are learning you by your question, by your background context that you gave us. You see how you are awakening late in life when you have adult children? How the lessons are now becoming crystallized in your mind? It might be that way for them. So the other way is to stop trying to change them, to stop trying to have them get it, and to be more loving and patient, to hold them and their wounding that you partially created, of course, by your own words, by your own confession, and just see them. Be a safe person. In other words, be a safe. I was training staff. I wrote about this a little bit in the Audacity to Be You. I was training staff, our field staff, our field guides, and I was explaining to them it doesn't take a lot of talent or insight to confront somebody on justifying or rationalizing, for example, or in this case, taking the easy road. There's no great talent or skill in doing that. And yet most people think that's therapy actually, because they've experienced nothing else. But the real talent is keeping your mouth closed and being able to take care of yourself outside of the relationship in some of the context with your mentor, with your therapist, with your sponsor, with your friend, with your partner, your co-parent. So what I would say to you is focus on what they're doing well, know what you know, and be available if it comes up naturally in a discussion and you can share that with them when the iron is cold. See, folks, containing is hard. Containing being the therapeutic term for holding somebody else in patience and love and non-judgment and compassion. I remember years ago, I was doing supervision with my therapist, asking her for feedback, and a client that I'd been working with was doing amazing work, sharing amazing discussions they were having with family members that took a ton of courage and were reversing or eradicating old patterns from childhood. And I was just basking in the light of their sharing. And then at some point later in the session, they said something that sounded like the old version of themselves. And I said to my therapist, so what do I do about that old regressive comment? And she said to me, you know what I would say in that situation? And I said, well, that's what I'm paying this money for. That's why I'm here. I'd love to hear it. She said, I would just say to her, this client of yours, I would just say, that sounds amazing. You've done all these fantastic things and had these courageous discussions. Good job. See, in a behavioral sense, what you're doing is you're rewarding successive approximations is the term, which small steps. Ignore the weaknesses if you can, if they don't violate your boundaries, because observing the weaknesses and focusing on them and wanting them to change, that's yours probably. That's your stuff. It's probably at some level you wanting to eradicate or erase the legacy of the mistakes that you've made. That's why dropping it is the ability to drop it is an indication that you're not attached to it, that it's not your agenda. I cannot tell you guys how many times I've had a parent come to me in the context of parent work and want a child to see something or have a certain discussion or explore a certain topic that the parent is sure, and it's not even I disagree with them, that the parent is sure that is at the crux of the issue the child is dealing with. And through some patient conversation, we often and most often arrive at this point where that's your need, not the child's need. You need them to have that conversation. You need them to cross that threshold. See, our children are going to figure out most of the stuff. I'm not saying that treatment or therapy is unnecessary. I've had two of my children in my programs. All of my family members, including all of my children, go to psychotherapy regularly by their own choice. I'm a fan of working on one's self. But oftentimes we can't tell the difference between what's our issue and what's their issue, what's our need and what's their need. Right? That's part of what psychotherapy helps us to discover. That's how it informs us about our lives. So I would focus on their strengths, wait for an opportunity to offer an idea or a suggestion, drop it if it's not received or welcome. I don't think this is from the description of things. It's about a leverage trigger point for you. I don't think it's about leveraging and trying to find that leverage to get them to do an intervention like wilderness therapy. Come to a finding you yourself. Invite them to a finding you. One of the things I love about finding you, even for young adults, 20, 21-year-olds, we've had 18-year-olds, is that it's a 5-day commitment. But show them first how it's changed you. You know, when people leave the Finding You workshop, oftentimes their first instinct is to tell everybody about it, which is wonderful. It's a great business model for us, right? We love that word of mouth. But I think that the highest kind of way to sell the program is when someone goes home and apologizes to their loved one, to their child, to their spouse, and says something like, I think I've been unkind to you. I'm more aware of my issues than I was before the intensive, and I've acted them out on you in these ways, and I'm sorry. And then they walk away. And I got to tell you, if I'm a spouse or a child with any kind of consciousness, and somebody comes back from a workshop and says that to me, I'm interested in having more of that. I want, like Harry Met Sally, I want what she's having. I'm drawn to that. But if they come home with more answers about what I need to work on, that's the first stage. I kind of joke and tease about the fact that the book Codependency, Codependent No More, is probably the most gifted self-help book in the world. Because what we codependents do when we learn something is we want to teach it to somebody else, impose that idea on somebody else. So show them your work. Be patient. Focus on their strengths. Wait till the iron is cold. Be ready to drop it. Get clear on what you need and what they need, because they're not always the same. And sometimes, just like you've learned things late in life, it takes time. But more important than that, when a child feels like they're the project, they don't like to be around people who see them as a project. They really don't. It's a burden. It feels invasive, intrusive. It feels just, I want to be alone. I don't need that energy. So, thank you. I think I have time for one more question. Somebody writes, thanks for all that you do. I'd like your advice on how to deal with the electronics for a 16-year-old boy. It's exhausting to constantly be on top of him to get off of electronics. However, because his computer is needed to get his homework done, it's impossible to take away it completely. So what ends up happening is that I'm on top of him and it's ruining our relationship, which I know in the long run is more important. I don't know if I should let it go completely or constantly battle with him over it. Any insight you can provide is very much appreciated. Thanks. You know, I'll start off by addressing this question by saying, and it's true of every generation, but I think it's more vividly apparent to us now. Our children are not going to live in the same world that we lived in electronically. It's going to be something that it's going to be hard for us to imagine. It really is. I would encourage you to experiment with letting go. You know, there's an old saying that if you're trying to teach a child something and they're not getting it and you keep trying, they are not the slow learner, right? The reason I said to my daughter last year, I don't care if you don't want to graduate high school, that's your business. And by the way, I think I've shared in some broadcasts, if you've been listening, that she's gotten better grades since then than she's gotten her whole life. And if I even bring up her not graduating from high school, she jumps at me and says, I'm going to go to high school. I'm going to graduate. I'm going to go to college and probably graduate school. So don't say that anymore. Try doing the opposite of your instinct. Try leaning into it. Be willing to experiment. I don't know the answer. I have never parented a child in 2023 before. This is my first go around with 2023. They didn't have TikTok with my 3 older children. Social media wasn't as prolific or invasive or as secretive or elusive, right? Our children are going to be around screens and computers, and they're going to have to figure it out. So I don't have any more a recipe to offer to parents to figure out how to deal with this screen mess that we're all in together. I really don't. I don't know what AI is going to do. It's already changing the world. We will not be able to stop AI, and it's going to be dramatic, right? There's a lot of things that are happening. So be kind to yourself. I mean, this is what it all comes down to, right? Be kind to yourself. Be gentle with yourself. And know that nobody's ever done this before. And anybody who gives you advice and in that advice you feel that energy that they haven't figured out, how could they? My daughter, the 15-year-old, said a couple of months ago, month and a half ago, at the dinner table, she said it was in part because of talking to her therapist. She said, I realized none of us have ever done this before. I've never done this before, she said. And you guys have never done this before. And we have 4 kids and she's the 4th. But the world is different and it's changing and it's rapid. I don't know. But I would tell all of you, be willing to rebel against the experts, including me, all of you. Be willing to rebel against the books and the advice and the suggestions for behavioral contracts and simple solutions. This is painstaking, laborious, difficult work. And the only thing I can offer you all within the sound of my voice is that we're in this together. And sometimes I'll listen to a parent tell me a long story about the dilemma of their 8-year-old or their 16-year-old who's addicted to screens. And they give me a list of all the things that they've tried. And oftentimes my response at the end of that long description of an hour or so, I'll say, I don't have anything new except for to offer you love and patience and compassion, to go easy on yourself, to know that you don't have to have it figured out or have to have the answer. That's why when people say to me that, I hear people say, well, Brad would say this and Brad would say that. Oftentimes it's not accurate because I don't know the answers. I can talk about skills and principles and ideas and concepts, but I don't know what you should do. And I don't know what your child should do. And I support you in your messy, imperfect, crooked journey to figure it out. I'm sorry. I wish I had more. I would love to give an answer that was more specific than that. All right, folks. Any leftover questions we'll talk about next time. Get your phone ready if you want to look at any of the pages with any of the announcements. Point your camera on your phone and click on the web page that comes up associated with it. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. You can look at the QR code there. We have upcoming new programming on February 24th. I'm going to be doing the Conscious Parenting Workshop. I think we have a couple of spots left open. 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Pacific time. We'll have discussions, dialogue. You'll be on screen with me, so it won't just be typed questions, but we'll actually can have a back and forth in addition to, of course, me talking about some of these things, but it's going to be more like therapy. 9:30 to 4:30, February 24th. That is this Friday, actually. That's in a few days. May 26th, I'm going to be teaching a masterclass on attachment-based therapy. This is primarily for therapists and therapeutic staff. If you are a parent and you want to learn more about the theory of the method of attachment-based therapy, I won't make the translation for you during the workshop, but you're welcome to attend and make that translation or extrapolation yourself. On June 23rd through 25th, I'm going to be in the UK. I'm going to be actually in Canterbury near Kent, hosting a Finding You weekend. I'll be living with the participants. So if you live in the UK and you want to do a deep dive in your own work, June 23rd through 25th, we're coming to you. If you live in the United States and you want to do a Finding You here, the next offering will be March 22nd and April 19th after that. We also have online offerings. March 3rd is the next offering. We also have custom Finding Connection workshops for couples and Finding Family for families. If you want to, it's for a deep dive to get unstuck, to understand how the relationship you have with yourself, where it came from, and how it's contributing to the dilemmas and the questions you have today. We have support groups for our current and alumni families of our wilderness program. Our next available support group is February 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an alumni-only meeting for our wilderness alumni, parent alumni. February 28th, 6:30 p.m. is that offering. And then, of course, we have once a month an intensive support group, March 14th, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. You can contact Sarah D at evoketherapy.com. That's SARAD at evoketherapy.com, or visit our family involvement page on our website to learn more about these. We have coaches. So if you want an attachment-based informed coach to work on parenting, coupleship, even individuals, clarifying boundaries, working on parenting dynamics, wraparound support for kids coming home, contact coaching at evoketherapy.com. Here's a list of our, just a sheet of some of our therapists there. Contact our folks and we can set you up with one that is a good fit for you. We have pursuits, adventure trips for young adults and families, either or. You can do it as a family. Think therapy light or sober fun. You can have a therapist involved and do some fun stuff that is custom designed for what your family's interested in. Anywhere in the world, we have a lot of great adventure activities in Utah and Southern Utah to offer that we're tuned into, we're tied into, so we can take you there. Those can be anywhere from 3 to 30 days. In fact, my son, I mentioned that one of my children went through our main wilderness program. My now 20-year-old actually did a pursuits program, 30 days in the Dominican Republic. Talks about it being one of the life-changing experiences of his life. Contact us at intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information on that. We ask all current parents to attend 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. You can also go to refugerecovery.org to attend or find out about a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, less of an emphasis on a higher power, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, has free classes and resources in your local chapter. All of these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, any podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast in the search bar. Or you can listen to us on soundcloud.com with that same search. You can also go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch the broadcasts there. You can find Evoke Therapy Programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles @Evoke Therapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can also find the Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching either Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy or Evoke Therapy Intensives. Excuse me. Or you can go to the Evoke Therapy blog and find new content each week. If you want to give back, if you have an interest in giving back to people who can't afford therapy, our 3 charitable partners include ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, or EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. You can also earmark your contributions to go toward somebody and helping them pay for an Evoke program if that is your desire. All right, folks, my next broadcast will be a week from today on the 28th. I'm going to be talking about the role of the field guide, but more specifically about the role of mentoring, especially with teens. And like I did tonight in that first question, how to extrapolate what the field guide does and their role to our parenting, to what we do at home. So that'll be my next broadcast, February 28th, Tuesday, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, the role of the field guide. Look forward to that. All right, folks, thank you for joining me. I hope this is a helpful point of contact for you all, and for on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you. Thanks for being willing to do your work and showing up here tonight. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.